Welcome to the King's Table, a podcast of King's Hill Church in Boston, where we seek to elevate the Bible over opinion, answering the questions you have. I'm your host, Jonathan Mosley. Now, as a church, we've gone through a series recently called By Design on marriage, sex, and singleness. We've asked church members to throw out some questions. So today's question is this: how should Christians think about dating apps? Enjoy. Well, the Bible surprisingly has some great guidance for us as we think about this question. I'll admit that in a post-Christian context like Boston, you might not have as many prospects as you would in settings that are higher percentage Christian. The beauty of the local church is that it's family, not like a family, but it is a family. So if you're part of one, then your energies, your service, your time, your investment is going into loving that family, and that's a really good thing. But what if that church family is small and availability is low when it comes to potential marriage candidates? So I understand where that question is coming from. And I want to answer that question, but with some caveats. You might say some cautions. So here's my answer. Yes, dating apps are okay. They are permissible. But I would challenge us to consider something that goes beyond permissible. Listen to what Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 10. I think it's very insightful and goes a long way in helping us think about this question. So in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul, he's providing some help to the church of Corinth. They're asking questions around what kind of food they're allowed to eat. And in this particular case, should they eat meat that's been offered to demons? And the governing rule that he lays out is, in all things we're to give thanks, knowing that all good things come from his hand, but we're to seek the good of our neighbor. So he spells out how they seek the good of their neighbor, these believers in Corinth. So imagine a guest has made a meal and you're in the house and they don't mention, they're not believers here, and they don't mention that the meat was offered to an idol. Paul says, eat the meat, enjoy the meat. But if you're in someone's home, not a believer, they put meat in front of you and they go out of their way to tell you that the meat's been offered to an idol, he says, don't eat it. And then he gives the reason why. It's because your loving refusal makes a statement about whom you will honor first. In this case, God, even over the guest. Now, you know that the idol that the meat was offered to isn't real because there's only one true God, and that's Yahweh. That's Father, Son, Holy Spirit. We know that. But to your neighbor's conscience, that idol is very real. And so your refusal makes a line in the sand about whom comes first in your heart. And Paul writes, when he's talking about this, he says, listen, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. 1 Corinthians 10:23. So would it be permissible to eat the meat? Yes, but would it be helpful to that neighbor? The answer is no. It wouldn't be. So this actually, I think, is really important when it comes to the question of are dating apps all right? How should Christians think about these type of things? Because the principle here that Paul lays out in 1 Corinthians 10, it should govern a lot of the gray areas not explicitly mentioned in the Bible. The questions we ask when it comes to living godly lives should not be, is it okay? Is this movie okay to watch? Is it okay to go out for a beer? The question should be, actually, it's to go beyond permissible. The question should be, is this going to be helpful? Will this build up my faith and the faith of the one that I'm with? You see, the first question, when it comes to permission, when permission is at the center, it has the line in mind. And you know what I'm talking about. How close can I get to that line and it still be okay? And that's the wrong way to look at things. I never want to say, how close can I get to the line but still remain faithful to Chelsea, who's my wife? No, I don't want to think that way, right? The better question is, what's going to be most helpful to stay committed, to stay faithful, to stay in love with Chelsea, right? What's going to be most helpful? Not, hey, where's the line? And what's going to be okay? See, one has the minimalist approach to it, and one has the maximalist approach to it. And as believers, we want to take the maximalist approach. So when it comes to dating, I think the better question to ask is not, is it okay, but, hey, is it helpful? And the answer here is, it can be. Dating apps can be helpful. I've seen a lot of godly couples who have found each other through dating apps. Some God-glorifying marriages that began through dating apps. So are dating apps helpful? They can be. They can be. But they can also not be. So I mentioned that, yes, it's okay. And they can be helpful. But I also mentioned that I wanted to provide some cautions. So dating apps are okay. They can be helpful. But, ... there are some cautions. So let me give you just a few. One, when you create a dating profile, you're putting your best foot forward. You're putting very limited information about yourself out there, and people are deciding if you're a good fit for them. And this is vice versa, right? You're not given a lot of information to make wise judgments. And I would venture to say that many of us get on dating apps and we're looking for two things. Number one, are they attractive? And number two, do they say they're a Christian? But I would say that attractiveness is not a good way to begin a relationship. In a culture that idolizes romance, we've been taught to look at the appearance first, but that's not where God says to look first. He says that where he first looks is not at the appearance, but at the heart, 1 Samuel 16:7. So physical attractiveness is not a great starting point. What's a good starting point? Godliness. In dating apps, you bypass the most important quality. Instead of asking, are they godly? We're asking, are they attractive? Now, we have another question that we're going to answer in another podcast. How much chemistry is needed for a relationship? So I'm going to punt to that podcast to say more. But I just want to mention dating apps, they're not cultivating the right sort of eyes, right? Dating apps look for attraction when God says, look for godliness. One of the issues, I think, too, just explaining this idea that you'll find on dating profiles, is that when you actually meet someone in person, odds are, hopefully, you haven't said yes unless they've marked Christian, but their definition of Christian might be a lot different than yours. You really don't know if they marked Christian because they grew up that way, or they marked Christian even though they're not, but they really like the morality of Christians. So because they wanted to be matched up with someone that was Christian, they marked Christian. You have no idea what they mean by their profession of Christianity, right? You don't know how they're serving the local church. You don't know how they're loving those around them. You don't know their Bible reading habits. You don't know their character. The list could go on and on. Now, you've heard me say a lot that marriage is for mission. God brings two people together for his glory to provide to the world this living parable of Jesus' relationship to the church. The husband is to be sacrificial in his care and his provision. The wife is to come alongside the God-given vision of her husband, and together they carry out this assignment. God brings two people together to be lifelong teammates to advance his kingdom through their relationship. So what's needed for that mission to work? Well, you need a man or a woman who is serious about waging war against their own sin. You need a man or a woman that's deeply involved in their church, serving and sacrificing for the body of believers. You need a man or a woman who has holy ambition that drives their decision. And the problem with dating apps is that you just don't know if they have those. There's no observation phase. There's no discerning of who that person is, no discerning of character. It's wise for the mind to observe before the heart says yes to a person. But in dating apps, you're working backwards. Your heart is saying yes, and then your mind is having to figure out if it's right or wrong. And often when the heart goes first, it clouds the mind instead of the mind governing the heart. So I would say if you are using a dating app, that first date, get really serious about the questions you ask. Like, find out sooner, way sooner than later, if this person's for real. Do they really love Jesus with their heart, soul, mind, and strength? Do they really have this holy ambition to glorify God in all that they do? because when you just meet someone cold turkey, it's going to be hard to really know that. Whereas if you meet someone in the local church and you see them, know them, you're in small group together, you're serving shoulder to shoulder with them in a different ministry, you're getting to know their character. And I think it's really important that you often don't get through a dating app. All right, so that's caution number one. Caution number one. Caution number two is when you hop on a dating app, you're bypassing a really critical element when it comes to dating, which is community. And in our culture, we tend to think of relationships as personal and private, but that's not the biblical mentality we're supposed to have. It is personal, but our relationships should not be private. Now, of course, there's going to be topics that a couple should have alone, and later on, there's going to be topics that are reserved for spouses only. Of course there are. But one of the greatest safety nets that's been given to us to keep our faith intact and our love for God burning hot is a community of believers. Proverbs 14:11 tells us that it's in a multitude of counselors that there's safety. I remember when I met Chelsea, my wife, we met in Haiti and she was serving God, and I loved that about her. I wanted to know her more. I took some time to observe her that week and saw how she handled the Haitian heat and saw how she was willing to step in and do whatever it took to love on these kids there. And so I observed, wanted to know more. And I was in Boston at the time. She was going to grad school in South Carolina. So we started to date long distance. We worked out a plan where we would see each other once a month. She would come up to see me, and I'd come down to see her. Because of schedules, she often would come to see me more. But it was really important that when she came up or when I went down, that we hung out with other couples. I wanted others' input on our relationship because my community really knew me. And because they knew me, they knew who would make a good teammate for me. And not only that, they were able to listen to Chelsea's heart, know her story, her goals, and to see if she was really someone who wanted God to be first in her life. You know, it's communities of faith that can help spot the counterfeits. And I wanted the community that knew me best to know if Chelsea was for real. And as the relationship began to grow, it was this community of faith that stayed involved in the relationship for accountability, for encouragement, for prayer, for support. Think about the book, Song of Solomon. You have this woman and this man who were drawn to each other, but in chapter 1, you see that there is this community that rejoices over them finding one another. When you go on dating apps, it's just important to know that community is often absent. And if it stays that way, it can be really dangerous. So I would mention, as I've talked about, especially these two cautions, that there's no observation phase. There's no really discerning a person's character when you're using a dating app. That's one caution. And the other caution is that community is not involved. There are ways to overcome them, right? So I'm not saying don't use a dating app, but I am saying be aware of what's missing and be really intentional about compensating for what's missing, right? So you can go into a first date with guards up, your mind on high alert, and you can go into that first date intentional about asking difficult questions that will either reveal our heartfelt, genuine, sold-out faith of the other person, or it'll expose the superficiality of their profession, right? So go into that first date, guards up, filled with questions, getting your mind ahead of your heart. And you can also quickly get others involved if you found someone who you think will truly embrace this marriage as mission mentality with you. So you can overcome the obstacles, but it's good to know the cautions. And finally, I would say my last caution about using dating apps would be this: be careful that this app doesn't consume you, right? Facebook likes, Instagram pictures, they can offer this dopamine hit on the brain. And it's truly amazing how fast we can become attached to something. This is true for apps. And so if you have a dating app on your phone, my questions are, do you find yourself going to this app multiple times a day? Are you anxiously waiting to be matched with someone? Is this app capturing your imagination? Is it taking up mental space? An idol is something that we look to for security or happiness or even hope apart from God. So my caution is keep your heart with all vigilance to make sure that this app is not becoming an idol. So back to the question, are dating apps helpful? Well, the answer is they can be. They can be. Keep these cautions in mind, right? Make sure you get community involved. Make sure you're asking the hard questions up front. Make sure that app isn't becoming an idol. Now, I want to circle back. I think it's a worthy question. Are there possibly more helpful approaches when it comes to finding someone if marriage is a desire? And I'm closing here, but I think so. I think it's a worthy question to ask, because it might be true that you're interested in marriage and you want that. You would say you're content in singleness, which I would make sure before you really go on the hunt and find somebody you want to marry. Make sure you are content with your singleness, because if you feel like your heart is lacking something, it's not the person that's going to feel that. It's going to be Jesus. But you might say you're content in singleness, but marriage is still a desire. What to do? Is there something maybe more helpful than dating apps? And I think so. One practical step that I would just challenge you to consider, and it might sound really foreign to you, but one practical step is asking church leaders or other godly friends or couples in your church if they have someone that they might connect you with. This shouldn't be taboo. Actually, if someone asked me that, I'd welcome it, because marriage is a glorious thing. And I'd rather know someone desires that and come along them in the process and pray with them and reach out to other pastors in the city that might know someone I could connect them with. Right? That's community being part of the process. And instead of someone cold turkey hopping on to a dating app, what if that person who's single uses a trusted relational network that they've built? Translation, the church. Because this is getting the community of believers involved in the process. And you can trust the recommendation of a godly man or woman as they set you up onto a blind date. Even though you don't know a lot about them, you know that the important qualities, the essentials are there just by means of someone godly is recommending them to you. Just a thought. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast on dating apps. Glad you could join us at the King's Table. If you'd like more resources or information about King's Hill Church, you can visit us online at www.kingshillboston.com.